I remember that morning, like it's carved into my bones, the kind of memory that doesn't fade with age, just gets heavier. It was August 6th, 1942, and the sea was too still for a place at war. The Pacific had a strange silence to it, the kind that made the sound of your own heartbeat louder than the waves. I was stationed near Guadalcanal, part of a small naval detachment assisting with prisoner transport. The air smelled like oil, sweat, and the faint sweetness of jungle rock. We were told the men coming in were high-value captures, admirals, officers, men whose orders had sent fire into the sky above Pearl Harbor less than a year before. I thought I'd feel rage when I saw them, thought I'd want to put my hands around their throats and make them answer for my brother, for the sailors who never made it out of the harbor that morning. But when the truck rolled in and they stepped out, chained together, heads bowed, I didn't feel rage. I felt something colder. Pity, maybe. Confusion. They didn't look like the untouchable warriors we'd seen in newspapers or heard about in the briefings. They looked hollow. The weight of defeat had already begun to carve lines into their faces. Even their uniforms, once symbols of might, hung loose, stained with sweat and dust. We gathered them near a canvas tent, the sun pounding down so hard that the metal of my rifle burned my palm when I shifted it. There were 6 of them. I remember that number because I counted twice, not trusting my own eyes. 6 men who had once commanded fleets that ruled half the Pacific now stood in front of me, waiting for orders from boys who had been milking cows and fixing tractors just a year earlier. I caught the eye of one of them, an older man with grey threading through his hair, his jaw square and still, but his eyes looked like something inside him had died long before he was captured. He didn't speak. None of them did. They just stood there as if the act of standing was the only thing keeping them from falling apart completely. One of our interpreters whispered their names under his breath, reverent and nervous. Admiral Tanaka, Admiral Ito. The names sounded foreign, distant, like echoes from another world. Later, when they were led into the tent for questioning, I stayed outside, guarding the entrance. The heat was unbearable. Flies buzzed around the puddles of spilled coffee and cigarette ash at my feet. I tried not to listen, but voices carried through the thin canvas. The questions were sharp, relentless. The answers, low, slow, deliberate. They spoke in Japanese, their tone steady, but I could hear the tremor beneath it. I caught fragments of English from the officers conducting the interrogation. Pearl Harbor, resources, oil routes, underestimated. That word, underestimated, hung in the air like smoke. I didn't know what they were talking about at first, but then I heard it again, this time followed by a silence so heavy it seemed to press through the tent walls. Then came the interpreter's voice, flat but shaken. He said, "They believed America would retreat. They believed you'd lose your will to fight." You could feel the weight of that admission ripple through the camp. A couple of the younger guys nearby looked up from their posts, like they'd heard something sacred. It wasn't just the shock of what had been said, it was the way it was said, quiet, regretful, like the words themselves hurt to speak. I looked back at the tent, and through a gap in the flap, I saw one of the admirals sitting perfectly still, staring down at the dirt between his boots. His hands were trembling. He must have been thinking of what came after the Doolittle raid, Midway, the slow bleeding of their empire. He must have realized right then that they had set something in motion they could never stop. Later, when they were escorted out, one of them paused and looked at me. His face was unreadable. He said something in Japanese, too low for the interpreter to catch, but his eyes told me everything. Regret, not fear. That would have been too easy. It was something deeper, like a man who finally understood the cost of his own choices. I stood there, rifle in hand, the same weapon I'd trained to use against him and his men, and I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt tired. It was the first time I understood that war doesn't have clean lines between right and wrong. We were all trapped in it, swallowed by the same beast they had awakened. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on my cot, listening to the jungle breathing outside the tent, the hum of insects, the distant rumble of artillery from somewhere inland. I thought of my brother, of the Arizona burning, of the smoke rising into the morning sky back home. I wondered if any of those men had brothers too, if their mothers still prayed for them. The war had turned the world into a place where such thoughts felt like weakness, but I couldn't push them away. I realized that what I saw in their eyes wasn't just the shame of defeat, it was the understanding that they had made a mistake so vast it had changed the course of the world, and they would live the rest of their lives knowing it. And that's what stuck with me the most. Not the sound of gunfire, not the screams or the explosions, but that silence, that awful human silence When a man realizes he's lost something he can never get back. Tell me where you're watching this from, soldier. I want to know how far these old memories travel tonight. The days that followed blurred together, though I remember the smell of salt and sweat never leaving the air. The prisoners were moved from tent to tent, questioned, catalogued, watched. I wasn't part of the interrogations directly, but I was close enough to see their faces every morning and every night. It's strange how quickly men can age in war. A week on that island felt like a year. Their shoulders slumped lower each day, their uniforms a little dirtier, their eyes a little emptier. You could tell they were fighting a battle no one could see, one that wasn't on any map. They weren't trying to escape, not even hoping for rescue. They were just trying to hold on to what little remained of their dignity, the idea that they had fought for something that mattered. But the news that reached us each day told another story. Midway, Aleutians, the slow push toward the Solomons. The tide was turning, and they knew it long before we did. I remember one morning when I was ordered to escort one of them, Admiral Ito, the older one, to a separate tent for a private meeting with a naval intelligence officer. The Admiral's wrists were chained, but he still walked with his back straight, his steps measured, like a man leading a parade that no longer existed. When we entered the tent, the officer greeted him with a calm voice, almost polite. On the table were maps, documents, and photographs, some of them from Pearl Harbor, black and white prints of the wreckage, ships broken and burning, smoke rising over the harbor like a funeral pyre. The Admiral's eyes lingered on one photo, the USS Arizona, or what was left of it. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, he simply stared. I couldn't tell if he was proud or ashamed, or maybe both. Then the officer asked him, "Was it worth it?" The translator repeated the question in Japanese. For a long time, Ito said nothing. He just kept staring at the picture. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low I could barely hear it. The translator hesitated, then said, "He says, they believed it would end the war quickly, that America would not have the will to fight back." That was the first time I saw an American officer speechless. The room went still, the only sound the buzzing of a fly against the canvas wall. The Admiral continued to speak, slower now, as if each word was being pulled from somewhere deep and painful. The translator's voice trembled as he repeated, "He says, they did not understand what they had awakened. They thought they struck fear. Instead, they struck fury." That last word hit me hard. Fury. That's what it was. Pearl Harbor hadn't just wounded us. It had ignited something raw and unstoppable. The same boys who'd been farming fields, fixing cars, and studying at colleges suddenly carried rifles, their hearts full of fire. I thought of the men who had enlisted after the attack, of the long lines outside recruitment offices, of the families who hung blue stars in their windows. The Admiral must have seen that same fire in our eyes every time one of us walked past. After the interrogation, I walked him back to the holding tent. He didn't look at me until we reached the entrance, and then he stopped. For a moment, neither of us said a word. The jungle was alive with noise. Insects, birds, the faint rumble of artillery far away. But between us there was a silence that felt heavier than all of it. Finally, he spoke softly in Japanese, a phrase I didn't understand until the interpreter behind me whispered. He says, "In war, no one wins. We only trade pain." I don't know why, but those words hit me harder than any bullet could. Maybe because deep down I knew he was right. That night, I sat by the shore, watching the moonlight shimmer over the waves. The Pacific stretched out endlessly before me, calm and beautiful, hiding all the bodies it had swallowed. I thought of Pearl Harbor again, of the smoke, the screams, the fire reflecting off the water. I remembered how helpless I'd felt that morning, watching from the docks, the sound of explosions echoing through the air. And now, months later, I was sitting across from the men who had ordered it, men who had once believed they could break us. The strange thing was, I didn't feel hate anymore, just exhaustion. I think that's what war does. It burns the hate out of you until all that's left is the ash of understanding. The next day, new orders came in. We were to prepare for movement inland. The campaign on Guadalcanal was heating up, and everyone knew it would be bloody. Before we left, I walked past the prisoners one last time. The admirals sat together, heads bowed, speaking quietly among themselves. When one of them looked up, his eyes met mine again. That same haunted look, the kind that says a man has seen too much of the truth. I nodded to him. He nodded back. No words, no anger, no pride. Just two soldiers, trapped on opposite sides of the same storm. It was in that moment I realized something I've carried with me ever since. That victory in war isn't about who kills the most or conquers the most land. It's about who can bear the most pain and still stand. And both sides, in their own way, were breaking. If you're still here with me, hearing these memories, hit that subscribe, not for me, but for the stories that remind us what it costs to be human when the world forgets. The day we moved inland, the rain came down so hard it felt like the sky was punishing us. Guadalcanal wasn't a place for men, it was a place for ghosts, a steaming jungle that swallowed sound and breath alike. The mud clung to our boots, sucking at every step, and the air was thick enough to choke on. My uniform was soaked through before we'd gone a mile. I could still hear the cries of birds above the trees, sharp and sudden, like the jungle itself was mocking us. Every man in the column carried the same look, eyes half dead, jaw set, face streaked with rain and dirt. We weren't soldiers anymore, we were animals, crawling through the green hell with rifles and fear as our only compass. We had been told the Japanese had fallen back deeper into the interior, but we knew better. You didn't need orders to feel when death was close. You could smell it, gun oil, rotting leaves, the faint metallic tang of blood long spilled. The scouts ahead moved in silence, their faces painted with mud, rifles raised. Every step we took could have been our last, and every shadow looked like it was breathing. I remember thinking, absurdly, that somewhere behind those same trees were men who had families, children, lives they once dreamed of returning to, and yet here we all were, waiting to kill each other in a jungle none of us wanted to be in. By midday, the heat had returned. The rain stopped, but the air felt heavier, as if the storm had only moved inside us. We halted near a clearing, the kind of place that made you uneasy because it was too open, too quiet. The lieutenant motioned for us to take cover along the edge. I crouched behind a fallen log, hands shaking slightly as I checked my rifle. The mud made everything slick. Even my trigger finger felt like it was wrapped in glue. Somewhere ahead, something moved. A branch snapping, a flash of movement low to the ground. We froze. The next sound was a scream, cut short by gunfire. Then, all hell broke loose. The first shots echoed like thunder, rolling through the jungle in bursts of chaos. I remember firing without thinking, the recoil slamming into my shoulder, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the wet earth. Bullets tore through the leaves, splinters flying. Someone shouted to flank left, another screamed for a medic. The world became nothing but noise, screaming, shooting, the thump of grenades shaking the ground beneath us. I saw a man I'd eaten breakfast with that morning collapse beside me, his helmet rolling off, eyes wide open and empty. There was no time to grieve, no time to even breathe. War didn't wait for emotion, it just consumed it. The enemy was close, too close. I could see their faces through the brush, painted, desperate, firing wildly. They weren't the composed, silent admirals I had seen days earlier. These were boys, barely older than we were, fighting to the last bullet because surrender wasn't in their language. I fired again and again, the sound ringing in my ears until it felt like silence. When it was over, when the last echoes died and the smoke cleared, the jungle was still again. The ground was littered with bodies, some ours, some theirs, all the same in death. I remember sitting there afterward, my rifle resting across my knees, rain starting to fall again in soft, steady drops. The lieutenant walked past, blood streaked across his sleeve, eyes hollow. "Get ready," he muttered. "They'll come again." But I didn't move. I just stared at the man lying a few feet away from me, a Japanese soldier, his hand clutching a small photograph half buried in the mud. I leaned forward and pulled it free. It was a picture of a woman and a little girl, both smiling. For a long time, I just stared at it, rain dripping from the brim of my helmet onto the image until the faces began to blur. I don't know why I kept it, but I did. I folded it carefully and slid it into my pocket. Maybe I needed to believe that even here, in this nightmare, something human still existed. That night we set up camp in the clearing. The corpses had been buried or dragged away, though the smell lingered like a stain we couldn't wash off. The jungle was dark, the kind of dark that swallows light whole. I sat with a few others by a small fire, the flames barely fighting the damp air. Nobody spoke for a while. Then one of the guys, a kid from Ohio named Peters, said softly, "You ever think about Pearl?" I looked up, surprised he'd asked it out loud. "Every day," I said. He nodded, staring into the fire. "I used to think if I killed enough of them it would make it right," he said. "But it never does. It just makes me feel less human." I didn't answer, because there was nothing to say. He was right. Later, as the fire burned down to embers, I pulled that photo from my pocket. I thought of the admirals in the tent, of Admiral Ito saying that war only trades pain. Maybe this was what. Maybe every bullet fired was just another piece of someone's soul being spent. I looked around at the faces of the men sitting near me, tired, dirty, eyes fixed on nothing. and I realized that we were all the same. The only difference between us and the enemy was the direction we were facing when we pulled the trigger. At dawn, we moved again. The sound of artillery echoed in the distance, and smoke rose from somewhere beyond the trees. I tightened the strap of my helmet and followed the line forward, one foot sinking into the mud after another. The picture in my pocket felt like a heartbeat, a reminder that somewhere, far from this place, someone was still waiting for someone who wasn't coming home. That thought kept me going. It also broke me. The war was far from over, and in my gut, I knew we'd barely begun to understand the cost. But as the jungle swallowed us again, I carried that picture close, and for the first time, I didn't feel hatred for the man I'd taken it from. I just felt sorry that we were both caught in the same storm. If you've made it this far into the story, take a second to subscribe, not for the battles or the blood, but for the truth of what war does to a man's heart and how we keep trying to remember what it means to be human. The fighting didn't stop after that day. It only grew thicker, more desperate, like the jungle itself wanted to swallow us whole. Weeks bled together, each one marked by rain, hunger, and the stench of decay. You stop counting days out there. You live between bullets and the sound of your own breath. Sleep becomes a thing you steal in moments, like a thief afraid of being caught. I'd wake up drenched, not sure if it was sweat or rain, my fingers gripping my rifle as if it were part of my body. The sounds of the jungle never stopped. Frogs, insects, distant screams, all blending into a kind of madness that made you forget there was ever a world beyond the trees. By then, disease had taken nearly as many men as the enemy. Malaria, dysentery, infection, names that sounded almost harmless back home. But here, they were killers. You'd see a man fall one morning, and by night he'd be gone, his body already shrinking into itself. We burned the dead when we could. The smell haunted everything: smoke, flesh, mud. We learned to eat fast, to look away when the stretchers passed by. The first time I helped bury someone, I whispered a prayer. The 10th time, I just shoveled dirt. You couldn't afford to care too much. Caring made you weak, and weakness got you killed. But there were moments, strange, quiet moments, when something inside would break through that shell of numbness. I remember one evening after a long march, we stopped by a small river to refill canteens. The water was clear, almost beautiful, running smooth over stones. I knelt to drink and saw my reflection. For a second, I didn't recognize myself. My face was gaunt, eyes sunken, stubble thick. I looked like an old man trapped in a young body. Then, behind my reflection, I saw movement, a figure across the river. My rifle came up before I even thought. Safety off, finger on the trigger. The figure froze. He was Japanese, young, barely more than a boy, maybe 17. He held no weapon, just stood there, eyes wide, as terrified as I was. We stared at each other, neither moving. Time stretched thin. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. Then, without a word, he turned and vanished into the trees. I lowered my rifle slowly, my hands trembling. That moment has never left me. I could have shot him. He could have shot me, but we didn't. Maybe we were both too tired. Or maybe, for just one breath, we remembered we were human. The days kept grinding us down. We'd moved through areas where the jungle floor was still blackened from bombardment, the ground cracked and littered with twisted metal. You could smell cordite and death even weeks after a battle. There was one ridge, we called it the Screaming Hill, where we found hundreds of enemy bodies piled in shallow trenches. The flies were so thick, they looked like smoke. I remember stepping carefully among them, trying not to look at their faces, but you can't avoid faces. Some looked peaceful, as if they'd just fallen asleep. Others were twisted, mouths open, eyes staring. Someone joked that they'd be back for us in our dreams. No one laughed. That night, sitting by another dim fire, I took out that photograph, the one of the Japanese soldier's family. It was creased and faded now, but I could still make out their smiles. I don't know why, but I whispered an apology. Not to him, not to them, but to the universe for what we'd become. A few feet away, Peters was cleaning his rifle. "You still think about those prisoners?" he asked suddenly. I looked at him. "The Admirals," he nodded. "Yeah." I thought for a moment. "Every day," he said. "Do you ever think maybe they were just doing what they thought was right?" I didn't answer. Not because I disagreed, but because I didn't want to admit that maybe he was right. 2 nights later, we were ambushed again. It happened fast, in the dark, gunfire flashing like lightning between the trees. I dropped to the ground, crawling for cover as bullets sliced through the air. The noise was deafening, shouting, screaming, the crack of rifles. Somewhere to my left, Peters went down. I couldn't see him, but I heard his voice, raw and panicked, calling my name. I tried to reach him, crawling through the mud, but the fire was too heavy. Grenades exploded around us, shaking the earth. When the shooting finally stopped, when the jungle went silent again, I found him lying face up, chest torn open. His hand was still clutching his dog tags. I sat beside him for a long time, too numb to cry. I just kept staring at his face until the dawn light came and turned everything grey. When the medics came, I handed them his tags. One of them asked if he'd said anything before he died. I thought about that last question he'd asked me by the fire, about the Admirals, about what was right. I wanted to tell him yes, he'd said something profound, something worth remembering, but all I said was, no, he didn't say a thing. That morning, I buried the photograph beside him. It felt right somehow. The picture of a Japanese soldier's family lying with an American boy who'd lost his own. I figured maybe, in the dirt of that island, they could find peace that the living never would. We left the ridge that afternoon. The jungle swallowed the graves behind us. I remember looking back once, the trees closing like curtains, and thinking how strange it was that a place so green could feel so empty. War changes the way you see colour. Everything becomes shades of grey. Later, when we reached the coast again, I saw the prisoners being loaded onto ships for transport. The Admirals were among them. Their faces were older, thinner, their uniforms tattered. Admiral Ito glanced at me as he passed. For a moment, I thought I saw something in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or grief. He raised a hand slightly, a gesture so small it might have been nothing, but I nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness, it was something quieter, understanding. That night, as the sun sank into the ocean, I sat on the beach watching the waves roll in. The world felt unbearably quiet. I thought of all the faces I'd seen, the ones who'd lived and the ones who hadn't. I thought of Pearl Harbor, of the smoke and the fire, and of how that moment had led me here, a young man sitting alone on an island that would never leave his mind. The war had started with pride, with speech and flags, but by then, all it was left with was ghosts. If you've stayed with me this far, hit that subscribe, not for the glory, not for the history, but for the truth of men who walked through hell and came back carrying silence instead of medals. When they shipped us off Guadalcanal, it didn't feel like leaving. It felt like escaping a place that had already taken more than it could, but still wanted something from us. The transport ship was overcrowded, the air thick with sweat, oil, and the sour stench of men who hadn't known clean clothes or comfort for months. We didn't talk much. The sea stretched out in every direction, endless and indifferent, a dark mirror for what we carried inside. Some men played cards on the deck, others smoked in silence, staring at nothing. I stood by the rail most nights, the wind cold against my face, watching the waves break into white foam and fade away. I'd think about the faces I'd left buried in that jungle. Peters, Miller, Lieutenant Harris. Too many names, not enough graves. I used to imagine their voices in the wind, like they were still out there somewhere, waiting. A chaplain came around one evening, handing out small Bibles. I took one, though I didn't open it. Faith had become complicated. I'd seen too much to believe in the same way I used to. I remember asking him, where do they all go? The ones we leave behind? He looked at me for a long time before saying softly, wherever they believed they'd find peace. I didn't have an answer to that, so I just nodded and turned back to the sea. I wasn't sure there was peace left for any of us. When we reached Espiritu Santo, we were given 2 weeks to rest before reassignment. The first night on solid ground felt unreal. The smell of cooked food, the sound of laughter, even the simple sight of electric lights, all of it felt foreign. I should have felt relief, but instead I felt empty. I couldn't sleep in a real bed. The quiet felt wrong, almost threatening. I woke up sweating, my hand searching for my rifle that wasn't there. Every sound, a door closing, a truck backfiring, sent my heart racing. I didn't know it then, but the war had already followed me home, even though home was still an ocean away. During those days, I kept thinking about Admiral Ito and the others. Sometimes I wondered if they were still alive, or if they'd been executed somewhere in silence. The memory of his words haunted me. In war, no one wins, we only trade pain. I started to see it everywhere, in the faces of the men drinking themselves numb at the canteen, in the eyes of the nurses who'd seen too many broken bodies come through their tents. It wasn't victory we were chasing, it was survival, and even that felt fragile. One afternoon, I was called to help unload supplies at the dock, crates of ammunition, rations and medical kits, the endless cycle of war feeding itself. As I worked, I saw a line of wounded being carried from a hospital ship. One of them was barely conscious, his body wrapped in bandages, his face swollen and pale. He was whispering something over and over, a single word I couldn't make out. When I got closer, I realized he was saying home, just that one word, again and again. It hit me like a punch, because I knew what he meant. Not a place, but a feeling we'd all lost somewhere out there in the mud and the blood. That night, I sat alone near the edge of the airfield, watching the planes take off and disappear into the dark sky. Each one carried men headed to another island, another fight. I wondered if they'd come back. I wondered if I would too. I reached into my pocket and felt the crumpled photograph, the Japanese soldier's family. It was almost falling apart now, edges torn, faces fading, but I couldn't let it go. It had become a piece of my own story, a reminder that every shot fired, every body left behind, belonged to someone's world. Sometimes I imagined that little girl had grown up and wondered what happened to her father. Maybe she hated us. Maybe she never even knew his name. That thought made my chest tighten. I didn't know why, but I prayed for her. The only prayer I remember saying during that whole damn war. 2 weeks later, orders came. We were headed north again, toward the Solomons. Another campaign, another chapter in a war that felt endless. As we boarded the ship, I looked back at the island, the lights of the docks flickering against the black water. I thought of all the men who'd walked this same path before me, of how few of them were still standing. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and fuel, and I realized that every place we touched would be scarred by us, just as we were scarred by it. On the deck that night, under a sky crowded with stars, I thought about what would be left when it was all over. I wasn't sure I'd recognize myself if I ever made it home. War doesn't just take your life, it takes pieces of you one by one, until what's left barely resembles the man who left. I looked at the younger guys leaning against the rail, laughing nervously, and I wanted to tell them to remember who they were, to hold on to it no matter what, but I didn't. You don't give advice in war. You just hope the next one in line survives long enough to learn what you did. That night, before I finally closed my eyes, I made myself a promise. If I lived through it, if I ever set foot on American soil again, I'd tell these stories. Not the glory, not the victory, but the truth, the cost of what we became out there. And maybe, if people heard it, they'd think twice before chasing the same madness again. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, hit that subscribe. Not for me, but for every soul who never made it back to tell theirs. I've often wondered what it means to survive. People think it's about luck, about being in the right place when the bullets miss. But it isn't. Surviving is a punishment you carry long after the shooting stops. The war doesn't end when the guns go silent. It just moves inside you. I didn't understand that at the time. When they finally shipped me back to the States in late '45, I thought it was over. I stepped off the transport ship in San Francisco, expecting to feel something like joy, relief, maybe even pride. Instead, I felt nothing. The crowd was there, waving flags, bands playing, people shouting welcome home. But all I could see were the empty spaces, the ones left behind on islands that didn't have names anymore. The noise around me faded, replaced by the soft memory of waves breaking on black sand. I spent the first few months back home, trying to remember how to live. My mother cried when she saw me. She said I looked older, harder. I told her it was just the sun, the long days, but she knew. Mothers always know. My father shook my hand like I was a stranger, proud but distant. I slept in my old room, the one that still had a baseball glove on the shelf and photos of me and my brother before the war. I used to stare at those photos for hours, trying to remember who that boy had been. The laughter in those pictures felt like someone else's life. At night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. Sometimes I'd wake up on the floor, heart racing, drenched in sweat, the echoes of jungle gunfire still ringing in my ears. The doctors called it battle fatigue. We didn't have words like trauma back then. They told us to get some rest, to find work, to move on. But how do you move on when the war is still playing behind your eyelids every time you close them? I started working at the docks, hauling cargo, anything that kept my hands busy and my mind blank. The sound of the cranes, the grind of metal, it all reminded me of the machinery of war. But at least this time it was building instead of breaking. Sometimes I'd see men I'd served with. We'd meet at bars or veterans' halls, talk about the old days, though we rarely mentioned the bad parts. There was an unspoken rule. You could talk about the missions, the medals, the victories, but not the screams, not the smell, not the faces. We all carried our ghosts in silence. I think that's why we drank so much. The whiskey helped blur the edges of memory, made the faces fade for a few hours, but they always came back. They always do. One evening, years later, I went to a veterans reunion. Most of the men had gone grey or gone missing. Some brought their wives, their kids, others came alone. They told stories, laughed, clapped each other on the back. I smiled, but I felt like I was standing outside a window, watching lives that had continued while mine stayed frozen somewhere in 1942. After the speeches, they played the anthem, and everyone stood. I looked around at those men, at their tired eyes, at the weight they still carried beneath the surface, and I realized something. None of us ever really came home. We just changed our uniforms. The war didn't leave us. We learned to live beside it. That night, I went home and opened an old box I'd kept locked away for years. Inside were my medals, a few letters, and the faded photograph of that Japanese family. The edges were worn, the faces barely visible, but I could still see the outline of the little girl's smile. I thought about Admiral Ito, about his words. In war, no one wins. He'd been right. We had built a world on ashes and called it victory. I closed my eyes and wondered if that little girl had survived, if she'd grown up to see peace. Maybe somewhere in Japan, there was an old woman who kept a picture too, wondering what became of the American boy who found it. Maybe that's how forgiveness starts. Not with words, but with shared silence. Sometimes, when I walk near the harbour at dusk, I see the sun dip below the water and feel that same Pacific wind from long ago. It carries the smell of salt, of rust, of memory. I breathe it in and let it remind me that I'm still here. Not because I was brave, not because I deserved it, but because the war decided to let me live. And every breath since has been a kind of debt I'm still paying. If you're still here, listening to these old echoes, hit that subscribe. Not for me, but so these stories don't disappear with the men who lived them. Sometimes, when people ask me about the war, I don't know what to tell them. They want stories, the kind that fit neatly into a movie reel, with heroes and victory and flags waving in slow motion. But that's not what I remember. What I remember are the silences between the noise, the smell of damp earth after the rain, the look in a dying man's eyes when he realizes it's too late, the feeling of a rifle trembling in my hands when I wasn't sure if I was still fighting the enemy or just trying to hold myself together. Those are the moments that stay. Those are the ghosts that don't fade. I'm an old man now. The mirror shows lines that weren't there before, and the years have turned my hair the colour of the ash that once fell over Pearl Harbor. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see that morning, the smoke rising over the water, the sound of alarms, the world ending in fire. It's strange how memory works. You forget birthday, names, faces, but pain remembers itself. It finds ways to live on, to echo quietly inside you, even when everything else grows still. I live alone now, in a small house near the coast. The sea has always been there for me, in one way or another. I walk down to the shore most evening, the wind cold against my skin, the waves rolling in like whispers from a life I left behind. Some nights, when the sky burns orange before dark, I can almost believe I see them out there. Peters, Miller, Harris, standing at the edge of the water, waiting. I talk to them sometimes, not out loud, not in words, just in thought. I tell them I'm sorry. Sorry I came back when they didn't. Sorry I never figured out what any of it meant. Sorry that I'm still here trying to make sense of a world that feels smaller now, quieter, but still carrying their voices somewhere in the wind. The younger folks, they call us heroes. They say we saved the world. Maybe we did. But saving the world doesn't mean saving yourself. You don't walk through fire and come out whole. You just learn to live with the burns. I still wake some nights with the sound of rain hitting the roof and think it's gunfire in the jungle. My hands still twitch like they're searching for a weapon. My dreams are still crowded with faces I can't name. The war ended a long time ago, but it's still here, stitched into me like an old wound that never quite healed. Sometimes I wonder what the Japanese admirals thought at the end, when the cities burned, when their empire fell. I wonder if Admiral Ito survived. If he did, I hope he found peace somewhere far from the noise of the world. I hope he got to see his family again. I hope that little girl in the photograph grew up free from the weight of her father's war. Because in the end, that's what it should have been about. Not revenge, not power, but the simple right to live without fear. We all wanted the same thing. We just forgot how to say it in the same language. Now, when I look back, I don't see enemy. I see men. Scared, proud, broken men who are caught in something bigger than all of us. And if there's any lesson left in what we did, it's that war doesn't make heroes. It just makes survivors. And survival is not glory, it's memory. The tide's coming in as I speak. The ocean still breathes the same way it did in 1942. I stand there sometime, the waves lapping at my boots, and I think of all the stories still buried beneath that water. The ones no one told, the ones no one will. Maybe that's why I keep talking, why I keep remembering, because someone has to. Someone has to carry these ghosts until they can rest. If this story found you tonight, if it made you feel something real, like you could hear the ocean or smell the gunpowder, or remember someone you lost, then like this video, share it, and subscribe. Because stories like this one aren't just about the past. They're warnings whispered through time, asking us not to forget what it costs to lose our humanity.